there are 6.4 billion people in the world, speaking upwards of 4,000 languages, spread across 238 countries.
And the United Nations tells us in every one of those countries, you'll find people, 2 billion of them in fact, who share a faith in one story, the story of Yeshua ben Yosef, or as we'd say in the West, Jesus, son of Joseph. This is where the story began, in the tiny strip of Roman-conquered land known as Palestine. And it was here, on the shores of Lake Galilee, that Yeshua, or Jesus, would begin to teach a message that would not only win over the Roman Empire, it would capture the heart of a third of the world's population. What this humble Jewish teacher said and did would shape the Western world decisively. It would inspire scientific discoveries, launch political and social movements, bring out the best and worst in people, and of course provide hope and meaning to countless millions throughout history. But how solid are the foundations of the Jesus story? Has faith been faithful in transmitting the message down through the centuries? Join me in the search for reliable historical sources that reveal to us the true Jesus. Join me on a quest for the Christ Files. We all vaguely know the story, or bits of it anyway. Jesus is born in a stable. He grows up to be a famous teacher and reputed healer. He ends up crucified on a Roman cross before being raised to life a couple of days later. Well, that's the story, but how reliable is it? Are we talking about history or legend, or perhaps a bit of both? Okay, so our first event is the birth of Jesus Christ. Would you say this is history, or are we dealing with a myth here? History.
Legend.
Maybe fact? Fact.
Fact. We're talking history.
Legend for you, history for you?
History.
History?
History. Legend.
I'd say this is history.
What about the stories of Jesus actually healing people? We're talking history, we're talking legend here?
Legend.
Legend. History.
Myth.
Bit of both. I'd say legend.
A 50-50 question.
A 50-50. All right, no worries at all. And then we're told that he was apparently crucified on a Roman cross. What would you say?
Say history for that.
Yeah, history. Fiction. Maybe part history, part legend.
Oh no, I think they whacked him.
Probably true.
History.
It happened to a lot of people, so it probably is history.
What about the punchline of the story? Jesus' resurrection.
Legend.
Fiction. Fiction.
History.
Fiction.
History.
You'd say history?
I'll say history.
Legend.
My father's gonna kill me about that, but yeah, I think it's fiction.
I think it's fiction.
I've been teaching courses on the life of Jesus for more than a decade, but lately, people have been asking me some pretty thoughtful questions. Who wrote the New Testament, the major source of Jesus' life? How long after Jesus was it written? How do you know the story hasn't changed? In short, how do we know what we know?
There seems to be a rising interest in, and yet scepticism toward, the historical origins of Christianity. But actually, there's a very good reason Christianity in particular is subjected to this kind of historical scrutiny.
Uniquely among the world religions, the central claims of Christianity concern not just timeless spiritual truths, but tangible historical events. At the heart of the New Testament are claims about things that are meant to have happened in Palestine between 5 BC and AD 30.
It's as if Christianity happily places its head on the chopping block of public scrutiny and invites anyone who wants to come and take a swing. And swing they do. The logic is pretty simple. If you claim that something spectacular took place in history, intelligent people are going to ask you historical questions. Our task is to find out how historians know what they know about Jesus, and we're going to go wherever the evidence leads.
The plan is pretty simple. Examine the historical sources. The older the source, the better chance we have of getting close to Jesus. The closer we get, the more likely we are to be able to piece together an accurate picture of the man behind the Christian faith. This is going to be a worldwide quest, but our first stop, strangely, is a local newsagent.
When it comes to investigating Christianity, there are historians and there are historians. It's a sad fact of scholarship, in many fields actually, that the most impressive work is generally too cautious, subtle, sophisticated, in other words, boring, ever to rate a mention in the popular media. I mean, the headline, "Jesus overturned first century dining laws," is hardly going to excite a news editor, even though it's based on pretty good evidence. What does make the front pages, though, is the more scandalous claim, whether or not there's any evidence.
There are three kinds of scholarship dealing with Jesus. Most of the really exciting things that turn up in your popular magazines and paperbacks come from what you could call the skeptical fringe of scholarship. Here, scholars relish offering new theories that call into question the results of broader scholarship. These scholars tend to avoid the academic forums where their work might be subjected to the scrutiny of their academic peers. At the other end of the spectrum are the Christian apologists, academics who are already convinced about Christianity and spend their time defending it against the skeptical scholars. Like the skeptics, they generally bypass the academic forums and publish straight to the public. In the middle is what you might call mainstream scholarship. This is where the vast majority of professional scholars can be found. These experts rarely hit the headlines, but they do appear regularly in the 100 or so academic journals dedicated to this field. These are the guys we want to talk to.
Not that sensational headlines are always a bad thing. One positive outcome of the recent popular discussion of Jesus is that the public has become aware of our first set of sources, the so-called Gnostic Gospels. Now, behind all the hype, what's the significance of these early Christian texts which didn't make it into the Bible?
The Gnostic Gospels represent our first step on the journey back to the historical Jesus. They're a collection of ancient texts from the 2nd and 3rd centuries, written mainly in Coptic, the language of Egypt. But to understand their importance for the history of Jesus, we're going to have to take a trip to my ancestral home, Scotland. Marcus Bachmann is Professor of Biblical and Early Christian Studies at the University of St Andrews.
We can identify certain perspectives that are distinctive to the Gnostic Gospels. One of those is that they have a great deal more interest, for the most part, in post-resurrection discourses of Jesus. So there's an awful lot of teaching that the risen Jesus does to his disciples, which is teaching that's quite different in flavour and in orientation from what you find in the Synoptic Gospels, certainly. Some of it has certain points of contact with what you find in the 4th Gospel. But there is almost no interest in narrative. There's almost no interest, certainly, in the story of Jesus before Easter. So in that sense, they're almost markedly uninterested in the historical Jesus, or what is often referred to as the historical Jesus, the kind of story of Jesus of Nazareth from birth to ministry to death and resurrection. It's really all, in a sense, the heavenly figure who speaks in the Gnostic Gospels.
So if we're trying to get back to the words and deeds of Jesus, how do the Gnostic Gospels taken together compare as historical sources with the Synoptic or New Testament Gospels?
Yes. I think they would not be widely regarded by scholars as primary sources for that. Partly that is because, in a sense, by their own design, they don't claim to be giving you a whole lot of information about the deeds of Jesus. They tend to focus on words of Jesus.
Are they freely available? Can anyone access this material?
We're in the fortunate position that in the late 1940s, a very large manuscript find was made in Egypt at a place called Nag Hammadi, which has brought to light a large number of these documents. There's a question of how widespread the reading of these Gnostic Gospels was, but certainly in Egypt they were very popular. In Syria they were clearly quite popular. The Gospel of Thomas was popular, but were not, in a sense, in the end, seen to compete successfully with the access to Jesus that's provided in the Synoptic Gospels.
The largest collection of Gnostic manuscripts is held in a small museum in Cairo.
Along with the Gospel of Thomas, this beautiful Coptic museum houses the only copy of the Gospel of Philip. Now, this is an explosive document, if you believe the hype, because of what it tells us about Jesus' girlfriend.
The Gospel of Philip is one of numerous leather-bound books discovered in 1945 near the Egyptian town of Nag Hammadi. This is the text, the only one, from which people have extracted the idea that Jesus married Mary Magdalene and had children with her. It all comes down to a couple of lines.
The Saviour loved Mary Magdalene more than all the disciples and kissed her on her mouth often. The other disciples said to him, "Why do you love her more than all of us?" The Saviour answered and said to them, "Why do I not love you like her?"
Because the manuscript is a little damaged, as you can see here, we're not exactly sure what was in the original. For instance, where it says Jesus kissed Mary on the mouth, this is a bit of guesswork, since just where the word mouth might have been, there's a lot of damage. Jesus may have kissed Mary on the cheek or the hand or the big toe, for all we know.
What's more disappointing for those of us who quite like the idea of Jesus the romantic is that the kiss mentioned here is almost certainly religious, since kissing fellow believers was a custom in the ancient world.
The point of this 2nd or 3rd century text is not that Mary is the ideal wife or girlfriend, it's that she is the ideal disciple to whom the other disciples should aspire.
But of course, even that assumes the Gospel of Philip records reliable historical information. And most experts say that is very unlikely. Being written at least 150 years after Jesus, mainstream historians read this Gospel and the other Gnostic Gospels not as sources of information about Jesus himself, but as windows into the beliefs of some 2nd and 3rd century Christian splinter groups.
This is the final page of the Gospel of Thomas, and the final paragraph basically says that any woman who wants to enter the kingdom of heaven must become a male, which is not terribly good news and gives you an indication of the difference between Gnostic beliefs and the beliefs of the Orthodox Christians.
In other words, in terms of our quest for the Christ files, the Gnostic Gospels aren't as helpful as we might have hoped. But there are some slightly earlier sources that do prove helpful.
Although today we think of Jesus as the founder of the world's largest religion, in his day he was hardly known at all outside of Palestine. So the fact that Jesus rates a mention in several non-Christian Greek and Roman writings of the period is frankly a little surprising. And the person to tell us about all of this is Professor Alana Nobbs of Macquarie University back in Australia.
Professor Nobbs is head of Macquarie's Department of Ancient History and president of the Society for the Study of Early Christianity.
Am I right, Alana, in thinking that it's a little surprising that Jesus rates a mention at all in the Greco-Roman writings?
Well, to my mind, yes. If I take Tacitus as my example, one of the greatest of the Roman historians had very fixed ideas of what was proper for history to contain. And Tacitus is very clear. He's writing about emperors, he's writing about warfare at home and abroad, he's writing about Rome and the provinces, and really he's not terribly interested as such in a minor province and certainly what to him would have been a very minor figure within that province. And of course the reason that the Christians come up in the narrative at all is because of the fire at Rome where Nero blamed the Christians. So it's unusual really to have so much devoted to Jesus. There's a possible reference, or probable I would say, my own judgment, reference to him in Suetonius, but again he's looking at the riots in Rome, and he talks about the instigation of Christus for these riots. Now, that is exactly the sort of offhand comment you'd expect.
The great Roman historian Tacitus, whom you just mentioned, refers to Jesus' death. He says Jesus was sentenced to death by the procurator Pontius Pilate, and Tacitus seems to be glad about it. What, from the Roman perspective, was so bad about Jesus? Why was he so objectionable to them?
It's not surprising at all that Tacitus seems to approve. From a Roman point of view, what was bad was rebellion against the Roman authority. And so Tacitus would have been completely supportive of the efforts of Pontius Pilate and any others to put down revolt in the provinces. So to take it from the Roman perspective, and they were conquerors, and they were fierce and cruel conquerors, we know that, seditious elements were to be removed.
Obviously, the Greco-Roman writings of this period provide a wealth of information of a background nature for understanding Jesus. Can you tell us a few of the more important things about the empire that we gain from these Greco-Roman sources?
We know, in fact, a considerable amount about life in the provinces at the times. We know the geography of the area is described by Strabo. We, of course, have accounts in Pliny, Josephus and Tacitus of life in the Roman provinces in the Roman East. We have archaeological sources. We have numismatic sources, which are coins. These are very interesting, many of them. And if we come to look down at the broader world of the Mediterranean, we have other information about seafaring ships into which we can put Paul's journeys in context. So within the world of its time, I think we can very easily situate the life and times of Jesus and his disciples and the spread of early Christianity from looking at a whole range of other materials.
So it's off to Rome for a closer look at these imperial authors. In the heart of Rome is the Vatican Library, one of the oldest libraries in the world. Among the hundreds of documents stored in humidity-controlled vaults here are the earliest references to a book written by a Greek intellectual called Celsus, or as others say, Celsus. Celsus was living and writing at the same time as most of the authors of the Gnostic Gospels. But whereas the Gnostics quite liked Jesus, or at least their version of him, Celsus had no time for this pretender. His criticisms have been widely published.
Celsus makes at least two controversial claims about Jesus. Here he says that Jesus is the illegitimate product of his mother's affair with a Roman soldier named Pantera. His birth, in other words, was highly suspicious. And as for Jesus' reported miracles, mere Egyptian sorcery.
Having tried his hand at certain magical powers, Jesus returned from Egypt and, on account of those powers, gave himself the title God.
Being written late in the 2nd century, it's difficult to know how much historical weight to give the claims of Celsus. Nevertheless, his comments do give us a good idea of how the Greek intelligentsia of the 2nd century viewed the reports about Jesus. Not very well.
Just as scornful is the reference to Jesus in Tacitus, the greatest of ancient Rome's historians. He published his famous Annals of Imperial Rome in about AD 114. Most of what you and I learned in high school about the Roman emperors, Caligula, Nero and so on, comes from Tacitus. What he has to say about Jesus and his followers is not so flattering, referring to Christianity as a deadly superstition and an evil well suited to Rome.
Christians derived their name from a man called Christ, who during the reign of Emperor Tiberius had been executed by sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate. The deadly superstition, thus checked for the moment, broke out afresh not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but also in the city of Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world meet and become popular.
Tacitus was hardly a fan, but his disdain for Christianity didn't prevent him from accurately relating a few salient details about its founder, when and where he lived, that he was known as Christ, and the circumstances of his death.
A near contemporary of Tacitus tells us something else about the Christians. In AD 110, Gaius Plinius Secundus, Pliny for short, is stationed in northern Turkey. He writes a letter to Emperor Trajan asking whether he should keep executing the followers of Jesus.
The sum total of their guilt or error was no more than the following. They had met regularly before dawn on a determined day and sung a hymn to Christ as to a god.
Pliny's letter confirms that by AD 110, and probably much earlier, Christians were worshipping the man Jesus as divine.
There's another writer who gets us a few decades closer to Jesus. Myra Bar Serapion was a father writing to his son from prison shortly after the Romans sacked Jerusalem in August AD 70. But to examine his evidence, it's off to London. Myra's letter has found its way into the Syriac collection of one of the best libraries in the world, the British Library. Mara is in prison, so he's feeling pretty persecuted. But he finds comfort in the fact that some of the great teachers of the past were also treated badly. He refers to Pythagoras, Socrates, and an unnamed wise king of the Jews who was executed.
What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was just after that that their kingdom was abolished. But the wise king did not die altogether. He lived on in the teaching which he had given.
Mara doesn't name this figure, so we can't be certain of the identification. But because no other Jewish man from the period fits the description of teacher, king, and martyr, mainstream historians take Mara's words as a passing reference to Jesus.
So what can we say about Jesus from these Greco-Roman writings? Well, we know he existed and that he was a teacher from Palestine. We know that some viewed him as a king and some even as divine. And of course, we know he was executed by order of the Roman procurator Pontius Pilate. And this is by no means an exhaustive list. Authors like Suetonius and Thallus also mention Jesus. But Greeks and Romans weren't the only ones to write about Jesus. Jews had their own reasons for mentioning him. After all, Jesus was a Jew.
And these early Jewish writings are where we pick up our search in the next episode.